Hello all. Okay, now what we want to do is get in and show you how to write a a stored procedure to actually insert data into a table. Okay, and so I created this add students procedure, and let's walk through this. This has been provided to you as your example that you should be able to utilize to do the same thing in your particular project. Okay. So with that said, what we needed to do is I created a procedure called USB, again, user stored procedure, add students, and I have these parameters. As you notice from the select statement, we also have parameters that we passed. We're going to be doing the same thing here. In our program, we're going to pass this data. The data was entered through a form, right? We're going to grab that, probably stick it in variables, and we have to pass these parameters to this particular stored procedure. A good practice when you're actually doing these parameters, just like when you pass data in a program, is to ensure that the data that's come across actually meets the same data types that you expect. So in this case here, this is what I'm actually doing. I'm receiving these parameters, which is actually kind of interesting. I got the student ID sitting here. I'm going to receive it, and I'm going to actually create output from it. In a way, that's almost considered a variable. Okay, we can actually create a variable. I don't necessarily have to pass that parameter. I can create a variable to do what I'm actually doing here, but in this case, what I can do is also just pass a blank parameter over. And the fact that I have this word output right here states that I'm going to be doing something with it. I'm actually going to be changing it around a little bit. Okay. All the rest of these pretty much meet the same criteria of the data type that's actually in the tables. So varchar, integer, date, time, you see everything's kind of sitting there. All right, the ones that we basically use. I put those in there. It knows what to expect. And basically what I did is I created a procedure in which I'm going to actually bring on these parameters. All right, now let's get into some of the things we talked about in the last video when it comes to what we're actually doing here. I have a few steps here. We're going to talk about these and walk through it, and then you can kind of see how this all works. The first thing here is the set. If you remember in the transaction piece that I showed you, there was a set there. In this case here, set x act underscore abort on. What this is saying is this, that if for some reason I come across errors in my particular transaction here, you can see in this transaction, I'm selecting the max, I'm doing different things in this case, all the way through. I'm doing 1, 2, 3, 4 different things for this insert. I know up to this point, we've just been doing one thing in our stored procedure. Here I'm doing 4 different things. 4 different, what do you want to say, SQL type statements, right, in my piece, as you'll see. Maybe 3, I'm sorry, there's actually 3 there, okay? And so we'll talk about these as we walk through it. But what this is basically saying is that if I get anything goes wrong here, roll it back. Now you know what rollback means, right? So if I did do something anywhere in here and it did not work for whatever particular reason, it's going to automatically roll it back to the existing, we would say, situation that was there before, meaning the data that was there before. I'm not going to insert it. I'm not going to commit to it. I'm literally going to roll it back. And that's what this does right here. A very powerful statement, don't you agree? Okay, so it's going to see this transaction right here, this whole transaction. If anything's wrong, it'll take, no matter how far it gets into it, it will roll it back to its original state before we actually started that transaction. Does that make sense? All right. For you, kind of a copy and paste. If you want to go look that up, you can see it yourself, how it kind of works. That's pretty much what you need to do in your particular situation for your stored procedure. As I told you before, we're doing transact SQL. So with that, there's transactions when it deals with select statements. I'm sorry, not select statements. I said that incorrectly. But we do transactions when it comes to inserts, updates, and deletes. So in this case, for this particular insert, I want to begin my transaction. I'm going to do a couple different things here. Let's go ahead and show you the first one. Okay, I'm going to separate this a little bit so you can see it. I'm selecting, okay, in this case, INT student ID, which is the output here. Again, I could have done this a couple different ways, but this is one way of doing it. I'm going to select that as our max. We did that before when we did inserts inline. Okay, so I'm just basically kind of emulating that. In this case here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to automatically take the max, add 1 to it, and it's going to be part of that new parameter. Pretty easy, huh? Okay. If nothing's there, we'll deal with that here in a second. Meaning if there was no records actually inserted into the table and I went and did a max and nothing was there, we'll deal with that in 1 second. If you recall, when we did it in our inline code, we actually asked the question if it was null or not. And if it was, we put 1 in there. If it wasn't, we put that number in there. Recall that? Look at this next piece here. It's kind of interesting. Students tab lock. Any idea what you think that Tablock X is all about? Tablock X is basically a command that says lock this particular table, okay, until the transaction is complete. So what we're doing here is to ensure that no other transaction is running at the exact same time that can mess up this particular insert. In this particular case, maybe duplicate the student ID if I did this incorrectly or somebody else snipped in here. I'm locking this. Nobody else can do anything against this table until this transaction has been committed. Does that make sense? And that's what Tablock X means. You can go look that up if you like. Okay, I'll probably put that out there. I may put that out there for you to actually to reference, if you would. It's pretty simple. That's pretty much what you do. There's a tab lock, which is more of a sharing type thing, and a Tablock X that truly shuts it down. Nobody else can touch that table for that nanosecond that we're executing these commands. This ensures that nobody else grabs the same ID by accident. Does that make sense? Okay, meaning the primary key of this row. What I'm doing in this next piece here is, if you remember what I said before, if you recall what we did in our inline piece, if we did this max and there wasn't anything there, okay, we sat back and said, well, if it's null values, if we go try to do the select statement and nothing comes back in our result set, with that, make my primary key 1. This is only for the situation that our table is completely empty, okay? If it's not, go ahead and put whatever the max plus 1 would be. Recall that from inline? This is what this is doing. We're mimicking in this case. This coalesce, if you will, is a function, okay, one of those functions we talked about in T-SQL that basically says this. It's kind of an interesting function, and I think I actually may have it up here for us. Let's see. Oh, boom, 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 boom. I thought I had it. There it is right there. Sorry about that. And it returns the first non-null value in the list. Really kind of odd, right? It's an odd function. I kind of think it's odd. And in this case here, null, 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 W3 schools. So in this case, what it would do is return W3 schools. If I did actually try this myself, and I did this, you would see it returned W3 schools, because here's the list. Null, 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 W3 schools, null, null. It returns the first null in the list. You might be saying, well, what the heck kind of function is that? Well, excuse me, interesting enough, it's a function that actually works really well for what we're trying to do. So in this case here, if I did do a select statement to this and there wasn't any data in my table, this would end up being empty because basically there was nothing there, right? There was nothing there to add to it. There was no max that came back. So int student ID will end up being empty, thus null values. So if nothing was there, this would be null, and then it would put 1 in my student ID, which is actually what we want. We want 1 in there because that'd be the first primary key. After we insert that first row, we would have primary keys in there, and it will return. Obviously, this would not be null anymore because it would find the next primary key. Does that make sense? I'm going to say it one more time. This is a function that will return the first null value in the list. My list here is only 2. You can have multiple things, as you saw from what I showed you on W3 schools. With that said, it's the first time we're adding a record, the student ID will be null, because it's not there. There's nothing there to be max on. It's an empty table, and thus it will return 1, which is what we want. That'd be our first primary key. Versus after that first insert, we would have primary keys. It would find the max, and then that student ID would work. Once that's all done, you can see I did my insert statement. A little bit more simple than what you did in your inline. Okay, you just basically have this, and then each one of the parameters represents the data that was passed to you, except for the student ID is something that we actually created. We do commit transaction, okay, and then go. You run this one time. Once again, you're creating a, in this case, you're creating this USB add students. Once you run this, it's done, okay? Meaning the stored procedure has now been created for you, and it's now ready to use against your program, okay? In the next video, we will show you how to call the stored procedure and insert data from your program. Make sense? All right, so take a look at all those things, kind of understand them all, okay? Again, this is provided to you. Make sure you understand each step. I don't think it's too hard, and I think hopefully you can relate to it based upon what we just taught you here. All right?